So, welcome everyone. I'm working in Flame 2020.1 with the latest Sapphire and Mocha Pro. The footage I'll be showing today is from our friends at Videvo. Great range of stock footage available from those guys. I'll begin with a look at Sapphire Builder. So I'm going to work in the timeline here. So I'm going to go to the timeline where I've got my source clip, and I'm going to go to the effects ribbon here and choose OpenFX. OpenFX is new for the current version of Flame, and we support the Sapphire tools along with Mocha Pro and particle illusion from Boris FX. So good range of tools to work with there. I'll just edit into that effect and go to the load plugin tab. You can see the suite of tools that I've got installed here, and I'm going to choose Sapphire Builder. Sapphire Builder allows me to create custom effects or custom transitions by combining any number of the 200 and something Sapphire plugins combined together. Pretty light interface in the Flame UI. In order to see the full tool set, I'll need to go into Edit Effect. So when I launch Edit Effect, we see the procedural workspace for combining effects here. If we have an input mask, we can feed a mask into this. If we're in batch, we can feed a source into the front, background into the background, and a mask. I'm working in the timeline, so I'll just be working with the source input here. Here we can see the full set of Sapphire tools, so I can start stacking these up and combining them. So if I start from scratch here and maybe start with, I don't know, blur motion, there's the tool that I've added to the composition, and here is the parameter tab where I can adjust the various parameters. It's also worth noting that I can show or hide any of these parameters in the Flame UI, and if I choose to hide just show just this one parameter, if I just close that down, now you can see that only that parameter is exposed in the Flame menu. So this is quite important for keeping the Flame UI uncluttered. If I go back into Edit Effect, obviously I can have access to all of the full range of the parameters for all of the effect nodes here. So if I now want to add another tool, for example, like, I don't know, Distort, put Distort upstream of my blur, and now I'm basically cooking a custom recipe combining multiple effects. You've got a matte input and various input to each node. So for example, if I wanted to control the distortion with the luminance of the source, I can feed that in here. So basically very easy to jam and experiment with building custom recipes for unique effects. If I go to the load menu here, I can load the individual effects, or I can go to the Builder Effects category where I can select from a very big library of specific presets that have been designed by VFX artists all over the world. So for example, if I go and choose just some random effects here, take a look at this one, for example. When we load an effect, you've got a preview window up here. We can scrub and see the result. Very useful for generating backgrounds and motion graphics and that kind of thing. If I choose an effect, you can just scrub through and see that. I can also search my presets here. What I'm going to do is search for bokeh effects, and I'm going to choose this preset, load it up, and once that comes in, then I'll be able to start editing it. Worth bearing in mind that I'm just working on a little MacBook Pro 2014, so I won't be breaking any speed records with performance, but obviously not a certified platform for Flame, but give you a general idea of the workflows and
Hey Dan, are you there, or did we lose you? Wonder if
I'll pick that as
there
an
you
example
go. Back.
and load that up. Am I back online?
Yes.
Okay, so just loading up my custom preset, and once that's loaded up, we'll just examine the node tree. What I've got here is preview selected nodes. So as I select each node, I've got the source here, got my blurred lights effect, large lights, small and side lights. So I'm combining those. Here I've got a caustics node with the source input fed into it, and I'm using that luma to modulate the intensity of the small lights here. And this is the final result of my custom effect that I built here. So I'm going to save that down, and now I want to isolate this to a region of interest. And something which is fairly recent innovation in Sapphire is the introduction of Mocha as a masking and roto splining tool set to hold back my effect. So if I jump into Edit Mocha, this will launch the Mocha UI, where I can start drawing and animating shapes to hold back my effects. So what I'm going to do here is just very quickly select the Spline tool and just quickly draw around the bus in the foreground, because I don't want that to be affected by the bokeh effect. And I'm going to right click the mouse to close the shape. So now I've created a shape, and I can move that around, scale it, and so on. And you'll note that the auto key button here is enabled, and that's created a keyframe on my timeline. So now I'm animating that shape. Z to zoom out and scroll, so I can see outside the image canvas. Scroll through that and just set the size and so on, and then just take that out of frame. So I'll just very roughly mask that that bus and set some keyframes for that. What I also want to do is a bit of depth cueing here. So I'm going to add another shape. So I'm going to choose one of the primitives here, which is a rectangle, and I'm going to add that down here. If I select the tool, I can soften the edge. That gives me a bit of feathering on the shape. If I show the selected mask, you can see the feathering here that's been applied. We can do this on a per edge basis. So what I'm going to do is go down here. I'm going to highlight these edges, hold the Alt key and drag up to set the feathering for the gradient. So now if I select both of my layers, you'll see that my matte consists of a sort of gradient for the depth and a foreground shape for the bus here. I'm now going to hit the save button to save that mask into the composition and exit from Mocha. So now it's the wrong way around, because my matte is white in the foreground. If I say show Mocha only, we can see that. I'm going to invert Mocha and add a little bit of blur just to soften that. So now I've animated my shape, turn show Mocha only off, and now I've held back my bokeh effect with my integrated Mocha mask. I'm going to exit out to the timeline and take a look at another example with lens flare. So what we're going to do here is use some Mocha masks to occlude a lens flare. So once again, I'm going to go into OpenFX and choose from the Sapphire lighting group, Sapphire Lens Flare, and that's applied with its default settings. If I double click to edit into that, you can see there's the default lens flare preset that's loaded here. I can load presets from the preset library. We have the browser, and this will show me a library of presets that I can work with. Alternatively, I can jump straight into the Flare Designer by hitting Edit Lens, which also provides access to the preset library here on the left. So the Flare Designer allows me to interactively design a lens flare and add and remove and edit elements as required. So if I put another element here, sort of rainbow flare, now I can adjust the position of that, move that around, and that's added to my formula for my lens flare. There's a very broad library of very attractive and realistic lens flares, ranging from the realistic to the more esoteric. I'm going to load that preset here and test it out. The one that I'm looking for is down here somewhere. Let's try that one. So there's my lens flare. I can audition it, edit it here, and if I hit OK, that's then saved into my composition, and I can start working with it. So the idea here is obviously as the beer glass comes in front of the lens flare, we want that to be occluded. So we're going to use Mocha to do that. Once again, if the ubiquitous Edit Mocha button is here in the lens flare menu. So if I edit Mocha, once again, I launch the Mocha UI, and now I can start to draw shapes. So once again, I'm going to choose an X-spline tool and tap to plot the points around my shape. Once again, I can either hit the keyboard shortcut C to close or right-click to close the shape. When you go to a vertex, you can adjust the tension on that vertex by dragging on the handle, and the position of the vertex by moving it around here. Right-clicking on a vertex will enable you to adjust the tension of all of the vertices simultaneously, or if I multi-select vertices, then I can choose those and adjust their tension as required. So once again, I've got the Auto key button enabled here. So as I move through the timeline and adjust the position of my shape, I'll select my layer here and pick it up with the white dashed line around here. This is the transform widget for the shape, where we can rotate, scale with the context sensitive cursor here. So if I change it to the rotate cursor and so on, I can change the orientation of the shape. What I'm going to do here is just move a little bit later in the timeline, add another keyframe. Up to this point, I've been manually animating my roto. If I jump to the next keyframe, as we'll see in some later examples, we have an integrated planar tracker for all of our shapes. So I'm going to choose to track that. And because it's not strictly a planar shape, you can see that the handle of the glass is actually sticking out in front. This may not be a super accurate track, but I'm not too concerned about this. I just want to get a general move for this shape. And a typical kind of workflow with tracking Mocha shapes is to track, and when you see any drift in the shape, leave Auto key on and just jump in there, add additional keyframes. And I've got a keyframe for the roto, and then we can continue the tracking on from that point. So it's a combination of automated tracking and manual roto to generate our shape here. I'm going to save that down and exit back to my lens flare menu. So now if I show my Mocha mask, there's my Mocha mask. This will now act as an occluder for my lens flare. What I'll do here is show my Mocha mask, and add a little bit of blur just to soften the edge. Maybe a little bit more than that. And now when I place my light here, as I scrub through the timeline, you can see that my lens flare is being occluded by the integrated Mocha mask. So this kind of workflow is possible with any of the Mocha effects, with any of the Sapphire effects, by simply hitting the Edit Mocha button to launch the integrated Mocha toolset. I'm just going to jump back into Mocha just to draw your attention to the parameter tabs here. This is quite light on parameters compared to the full Mocha toolset that we're going to look at in a moment. Basically, you just have your tracking controls where we can choose what motion parameters we choose to track, the percentage of pixels used inside the shape area to affect the accuracy of the track, and the adjust track menu where we can add additional keyframes to refine a track for additional precision. But basically all we can do within the integrated Mocha toolset that we find in Sapphire, and also within the Continuum family of plugins, is to animate shapes and track them. That's a light set of tools compared to the full Mocha Pro that we're now going to take a look at. So if we return back to the timeline here and move on to the next example, we're going to take a look at using the Stabilize tool in Mocha Pro. So with all these flashing lights and so on, this is quite a challenging thing to track using conventional trackers. So we're going to have a go at stabilizing it with Mocha Pro. So once again, I'll open the Open Effects list and select Mocha Pro and double click to edit into that. So now we have the Mocha Pro UI here under Launch Mocha UI. So I now want to draw your attention to the additional tools that are available in the Parameters tab, and this is all the cool things that Mocha Pro does, such as insert objects into your scene, remove unwanted images or image content from the scene, stabilize, reorient 360 footage, and solve cameras, and analyze lens distortion. So what we're going to do here is once we've measured our track, we're going to use that tracking data to stabilize the image. So I'll start by creating a primitive here. So we've got a primitive shape and rectangles or ellipses. I'm just going to align that with the keyboard, which is sort of pretty brightly lit, so that should provide a pretty stable pixel pattern for us to track. Now I'm going to increase the number of pixels used. The higher the number of pixels used, the greater the accuracy, but on high resolution footage it may not be necessary to use all of the pixels. I'm also going to choose to track the perspective in the scene as well. Now I'm going to hit the track forwards button to track the motion as the keyboard moves through the clip. And something that's worth doing whilst you're tracking is enabling the surface tool. The surface tool is a representation of the 4-point track data, which is derived from the analysis of the pixel pattern within the shape. These two are linked, but not inextricably so. We can link and unlink them as required. So what I'm doing here is just aligning the track with my shape. I can also turn on the grid overlay, the perspective grid overlay, so that whilst it's tracking, I can get a clear idea of the integrity of my track, and if there's any error or drift, I can jump in there and adjust the shape or adjust the parameters that are being used to measure the track to ensure that it stays locked. So now I've tracked my shape, I can use this tracking data to perform the stabilization. So now when I jump into the stabilize menu and play, you can see the partial stabilization of the image based on the selected parameters. At the moment, I'm only choosing to stabilize X and Y translation. There's a little bit of zoom in there as well. So if I choose to stabilize the zoom, now I've locked down the zoom. If I want to go in there and stabilize the shearing or the perspective, I can also do that as well. And I'm just going to choose to stabilize the basic parameters. Now you can see if I hit the X button and pan up, you can see at the bottom of the frame, we're getting a little bit of blanking happening at the bottom of the frame. Or Z to zoom in, you can see, obviously, because we're stabilizing it, we're losing a bit of picture detail. I'm going to zoom out now by Z, double click to reset the zoom. At the moment, the stabilization is being applied over 10 frames. So there's still a little bit of movement in there because it's being averaged. So this would be a useful setting if you had like a wobbly pan and you want to take the high frequency motion out. What I want to do is completely lock this down, so I'll enable maximum smoothing, and now that's locked. If I now want to fill the edges, if I go into the Fill tab and, sorry, into the Borders tab and zoom, now we zoom to fit to ensure that we use the maximum amount of picture information that's available without introducing any blanking. I could render this as a new image sequence, but this is not optimal workflow. What we're going to do is just save the setting down, and we're going to use the render module inside Flame. So this is the original unaffected clip, and if I look at the render module drop down here, these are all of the different effects that Mocha can apply, and I can choose stabilize module, turn on render, and now the stabilization is rendered interactively inside Flame. So if I play that down, there's the result. And if I turn that off again, you can see the original, and turn it on and scrub, you can see the stabilized version. So no need to export your rendered stuff out of Mocha and import it back into your host application. This workflow applies on all of the Mocha hosts. You can render all of your effects interactively within the host application. I'm going to exit back to the timeline and take a look at the next example, which is another thing that Mocha excels at, is removing unwanted picture detail. Once again, I'm going to drop into the timeline and choose Open Effects and load Mocha Pro. Launch the Mocha UI, and I'm going to perform a remove. So removing picture data from our clips in Mocha is a two-step process. First of all, we need to draw a shape around the area that we want to remove. So I want to remove the car here. You need to make sure that that shape covers the unwanted picture detail on every frame. So I'm just doing a quick animation of my roto to ensure that the unwanted picture detail is covered. You can see here there's a little bit of spray coming out here, so I'm just going to pull that vertex out so that includes that. So that's the area that I want to remove. Now I need to track the background to so that Mocha knows what's behind this picture content on a different frame. Obviously we can't see behind it here, but if we go forward in time, we can see the picture detail that can be used to remove the foreground picture data. So now I'm going to draw another shape for the background, and right click to close the shape, right click and drag on the tangent handles, and I'm going to place this below my foreground shape. This is an important step because there's a kind of a hierarchy of picture content that's further away from the camera or nearer to the camera in Mocha. So if I call this background and we'll call this car, so the car shape is closer to the camera than the road on which it's driving, so that's behind it. And this is an important concept. If I take a look at the mat for the car, you will note that some of the buttons have little triangles in the bottom, which means that they have options. So if I just select the mat for the car, select the background mat, that shows me the mat for those areas. If I choose to show the track mat, this is important because the track mat indicates what picture information the tracker is using to measure the track. So because the car is in front of the background, it acts as a holdout mat so that the motion of the car is ignored when measuring the track for the background. So this is very useful if we're trying to track something that's being occluded or affected by light or shadow or whatever. We can place a mat above it in the stacking order to occlude the track mat so that we get an accurate track. If we take a look over here in the layer properties, the cogwheel indicates that both of the shapes will be tracked. This means basically process this when tracking. Because I've already animated the car shape, I don't need to track it. So I'm going to turn off processing for the car shape, which will save me a little bit of time. I don't need to track it again. So now I'm going to choose the background shape and begin tracking forward. And once the tracking is complete, I can use the picture information from the background to hide the foreground image. We need to make sure that all of the picture information is available. So I'll start tracking forward again. So now we have completely covered that. After the event, I can go in and change the size of my shape, and it will still obey the track that's been measured for that shape. So now when I go to the car shape here and go to the remove tab, I can now perform the remove. In the render options here, I can render the entire clip. Again, I don't need to render the entire clip because this will be rendered interactively in Flame, but as a test, I can do a quick render to see what I'm going to get. So now it's using that picture information from behind the car to fill the foreground area. I can also use a little bit of blending to soften the edge as well. Test that again, and there's my result. Up here, I'm now looking at the remove. So if I go to a next frame, I'm not going to see anything because I haven't rendered that frame. Just to be tidy, I'm going to go up here and say Edit, Undo Render in all frames, and switch back to look at my currently selected layer. So now we're back at just previewing the move. As I say, we don't need to render this because this can be rendered interactively in Flame. I'm going to save that down, exit back to Flame, and in my module renders here, I'm going to choose to render the remove and enable the render. Worth bearing in mind that this is not going to be super fast because this is, as I mentioned before, just a little MacBook Pro. So as I scrub through it, won't be super interactive, but it should give you a general idea of what we'll get. So there's with my render enabled, and if I come down here and turn off render, we can see the original plate. Jump in there and turn the render back off again. So in a nutshell, that's the workflow for removing picture content in Mocha. If you have a panning shot or a moving foreground image, then it's easy to remove the foreground image because you know what's behind it. In some cases, this is not possible. So if we wanted to dress this set to make it look like it wasn't in modern days, we'd need to remove this with Mocha, but we can't see behind this. So we'll need to take another approach and create a clean plate. So I'm going to go once again into Mocha and jump into the Mocha UI and draw a shape for the area that I want to remove. And go ahead and track it. Enable perspective here and track that forward. When you're tracking something, you may not want to use, you may want to use a bigger area or a smaller area than the area that you're trying to insert or remove, or a completely different part of the picture. As long as it's coplanar, that will work fine. You see that my shape is not entirely lined up here. It's worth noting that that's really not important. If I go back and change this shape after the event, it will still obey the track that's been measured. So if I go back to the start of the timeline again and maybe tighten it up a little bit, as I scrub through the timeline, that modified shape is now following the track. So it's important to note that it's a shape that you use is not necessarily, the shape that you use for deriving the track is not necessarily the shape that you're using for the effect. It's just whatever shape gives you an accurate track. So now I need to create a clean plate. So if I go into the remove module, you can see the create clean plate option down here. So if I hit create, this is now creating a clean plate for this frame. We can create clean plates for multiple frames if there are lighting changes, and then we can morph in between those frames to ride the lighting changes. But I'm just going to use a single frame at the start of the clip here, and I'm going to put that in my clean plate folder and replace the one that's already there. So that is now the clean plate that I'm going to use. To save a little bit of time, I've already created another clean plate here. This is the fixed clean plate that I created with the paint tool in Flame by just cloning. So if I take this and overwrite the clean plate clip in my clean plate folder, the one that's being used by Mocha, when I go back into the Mocha UI and go back to the remove tab, select my foreground shape and say I would like to use clean plates exclusively for the remove, I can now begin removing the foreground area. But I need a background so that Mocha knows where the background is. So as I've already tracked the foreground area, I can save a little time. So if I go and draw my background shape to cover my background area, place this behind it. Again, it's important the priority here. Your background needs to sit behind your foreground. Now the background shape, I haven't tracked that yet, but I don't really need to because I've got the tracking information I need on the foreground shape. So you'll note that by default, the background shape is linked to its own track, which I haven't tracked yet. If I choose to link it to the track that I've already measured on the foreground shape, so it will follow the foreground shape. So now when I go back to the foreground, because we have a track background behind it, the remove is now enabled. So I'm going to use clean plates exclusively, do a quick test render of the result, and just to be tidy, undo the render in all frames and switch back to selected layer, save the effect down into Flame, And this time I'm going to choose the remove and render the remove. Once again, when I play, you'll see the end result rendered interactively in the Flame timeline. So now we're going to move on and take a look at some of the more esoteric things that we can do in Mocha. The next example, we're going to do the opposite thing that what we did here. Instead of removing something, we're going to insert something into a scene. So if we go to the next example and apply Mocha, edit into Mocha, I want to put a logo on the side of the truck. So I'm going to plot an X-spline shape around the region that I want to track. And I'm deliberately leaving a little bit of an air gap around the edge of the shape so that I can use those clearly defined edges as part of the tracking solution. This is a useful workflow if you're trying to track mobile phone screens or computer screens for doing screen replacements. You can use the bezel of the screen rather than the actual screen content to measure the track. This means you can use any highlights and shadows on the foreground as part of the composite and not have those interfere with the track. So now I'm going to enable another important tool here, the surface tool. This is the visualization of the track. So now I'm going to use the widget to edit the surface tool and align that so that it kind of follows the perspective that I'm trying to simulate here. So there's my perspective. I'll leave that enabled whilst I measure the track. And once again, we can enable the surface overlay, the perspective grid overlay, so that we can analyze eyeball the track as it's being measured and intervene if there's anything that needs adjusting whilst we're tracking it. And once the tracking is complete, I can choose an insert clip to fill that area. There are a number of preset objects that we can use to fill that area rather than external clip input. And these are useful for just testing the integrity of your remove in the Mocha UI. So once I completed the tracking, then I can go back here, set the perspective to align with the side of the lorry here and choose the insert clip. So I'm going to choose the Mocha logo. So now you can see that this is interactively rendered inside the Mocha UI, and you can see the perspective as that applies here. What I actually want to do here is break this out so that I can use it with an external input clip in batch. So I'm just going to set the aspect because it's kind of a circular logo that you might recognize when we get into batch. And I'm going to save this setup so that I can import it into batch. So when we hit the save button here, that's saving it into the current project. If I export the project, I'm going to export it to my desktop. What I'm doing is exporting the standalone Mocha project so that that can be used in any other host application or any other part of the host application. It's platform independent, so this Mocha project could be loaded in After Effects or Avid or Resolve or any other Mocha host. So you can do your tracking and your measurement in an offline program and bring it into your online on any host application on any platform, Windows, Linux, or OFX. So I'm going to save that down, exit, and in the Mocha menu, I'm going to choose to render my insert as a composite, And as I scrub through the timeline in Flame, you can see that that's now rendering that. But this is just a test really. So what I actually want to do is work in batch. So now I'm going to move from the timeline into batch, where I have my truck here and the Flame logo and a matte, and we're going to perform the composite in action. So we can do this in either in action or in Mocha. So if I add a Mocha node here and attach this, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit so you can see what the various node inputs are. So if I hold my cursor here, you can see the front input. I'll connect that to the front. Here's the back or the insert layer input. Once again, the tooltip will tell me that. And then we have our back input here. So we could feed that into Mocha and perform the composite in Mocha. Alternatively, we could use action to do that. So if I jump back into my timeline and go back into the Mocha UI and take a look at the surface tool for the current layer, there's the 4-point track that I want to export. So if we go into the tracking menu, you can see we have the option to export the tracking data for any layer. So I'm going to hit export tracking data, and here are the supported hosts, all of the usual suspects, including, of course, Autodesk Flame. So if we save that as truck on the desktop, save that down, exit from there, and jump back into batch. Rather than work with Mocha, I'm going to use action. Shift-C to collapse, because I like the old-fashioned round action nodes. Connect that into the background. Control-N for a new layer. Connect my foreground and my foreground matte. Jump into action. Tilde for the schematic view. Double-click on the surface and change the surface type to bilinear, which of course can be corner pinned. If I go into the vertices menu for the bilinear here, I can enter the tracker. Now I can load the tracking data that I saved earlier. This is the align option because the Mocha timeline started at 0, so it's offering me the option to start at frame 1, which is where my batch timeline starts. So I'll align that and just step back out into batch and T-click on here to set the timeline duration and jump back into action. And because I didn't have my my parameters set properly, I'm going to go back into the surface menu for this and into the tracking menu and load my tracking data from the desktop. And load that here. Oh, so in the surface menu, enter the tracker, and in the vertices menu, load my tracking data, this time the correct tracking data, the correct length, 74 frames, exit out of here, and in theory, that should have worked. So if we go back to the example that I set up earlier, you can see that's working as expected. If we jump down into action here, we can see that I've applied a different blending mode here. If I jump into the tracking menu for the surface, you can see the correctly aligned tracking points. Jump out of here, and you can see that the surface is now being applied as a different blending mode. So multiply, for example, so that we can print use any of the Flame blending modes or Photoshop blending modes to to perform the composite. So in the next example, we're going to take a look at offset, at unlinked tracking. So I'm going to zoom in here and take a look at an example where we've got something which is panning out of frame. So we've got a very long pan here, and this is obviously the area of interest may not stay in frame for the entire time. So if I return to batch, add a Mocha node here, connect the front input, and connect the back and the back mat, I can jump into Mocha and start measuring a track. So the idea here is that I'd like to place this graffiti tag on the wall up here. So I'll start by drawing a shape. I'll set up my shape perspective using the bricks to align it. Align my surface tool. And if I choose to set the insert clip as the insert layer, now you can see that as I adjust the surface tool, I'm adjusting the perspective of my logo that I'm inserting. Because this goes out of frame, I could lose this track information, but this is something that I can easily work around in Mocha by using an unlinked track workflow. At the moment, my shape, if I just turn the foreground, the tracking area off, my shape is linked to the tracker, which is controlling the shape. So eventually that's going to go out of frame and we're going to lose the track. What I'm going to do instead is to say, I don't want to link this to anything. I just want that shape to stay here and scan the area underneath the shape and then apply that perspective move to the object inside the tracking area. So basically this acts as a scanner to derive the 4-point tracking information to offset my object. This is very useful if your target's going out of frame, or if it's occluded or spoiled by atmospherics or lighting or shading. So now if I scrub back, you can see I've set my graffiti, got my graffiti tag moving around. I want this a little bit bigger, so I'm going to go into the insert menu and I'm going to change the opacity, back that off a little bit, increase the gain a little bit, and jump into the transform menu and increase the scale for the composition. Once again, save that down, exit into Flame, come back to Mocha, and Alt-2 to put up 2 views here. And in the Mocha menu, choose once again to render the insert. That's insert as a cutout. If I want to use that as another layer inside another action or another composition, or I can insert the composite. And that's now giving me an interactive render inside of Flame. Final couple of examples. I think we're running short of time now, so let's take a look at the automatic drawing tools in Mocha, the current version of Mocha. So I'm going to just zoom in here where I've got something that I'd like to isolate, the eye of this guy here, jump into Mocha, and rather than plotting a shape, I'm going to use this guy, which is the magnetic spline tool. I'm going to tap once, and now I'm going to move the mouse. And you'll see that Mocha is automatically detecting the high frequency edge and drawing automatically. When I tap again, that sets a control point, and right click to close the shape. if I have my shape selected and go to the magnetic spline tool, I've got a detail control up here, so I can set the complexity of the shape. I'll go in here and select all the vertices and round them off a little bit, whatever. And now I can start tracking that shape. So track my shape. And if there's any drift when you're doing this, if I select a point and go Alt-S, it will automatically snap to the nearest high frequency edge. Or so if one of my vertices is drifted, if I S and drag, it will automatically snap to the nearest edge. So using the same techniques that we used before when animating an X-spline, we can make sure that if there's any drift, we can just stop and realign the shapes. I'll save that down. And now we can see the result. What I want to do here is use the output of this Mocha node to feed one of Flame's native tools, in this case the color corrector. So if I say I would like to view the matte, and we'll blur the matte a little bit. So now we can use the luminance of this to feed the color warper matte input, and we'll feed our foreground in here. And now in the color warper, we can begin to color correct inside that region of interest. F1, F4 to see the result. Also, if we want to use that as a Gmask, we can export the Gmask from Mocha. If I want once again to launch the Mocha UI, select my shape. Shape data can be exported as a range of different formats for Nuke or After Effects or whatever. In this case, it's a Flame Gmask script. So if I go to a Gmask node and load a Gmask, once again I can align the frame. Now the Gmask setup, basically the Mocha setup has now been converted to a Gmask setup, which can be modified using all of the usual tools within Flame's toolset. So finally, last couple of examples, we're going to look at lens distortion. So in this example, I'm going to launch the Mocha UI and go into the lens module and hit locate lines. So this detects high frequency edges, and where we have straight lines following the arc of the lens distortion, we can say new line and then tap on each successive line to set the arc that we're analyzing. We can then choose the type of distortion depending on the type of lens, so a single parameter distortion for a simple curved lens, and hit calibrate to analyze the lens distortion. So here we have Understorm enabled, so if I hit render to test it, now it can use the lens distortion to underdistort the image. Alternatively, if we wanted to do some tracking of some foreground objects and have those obey the lens distortion, if I go in here and draw a shape, you'll see that when I move my shape around, you'll see that the shape is distorted according to the distortion analyzed by the lens module. So if I insert a clip here, if I insert, for example, a grid object and move that around, so if I go to my surface tool, enable the surface tool for this layer and move that around, you'll see that the grid is distorted according to the distortion, so that the analyzed by the lens module, so that will match correctly. So if I go in here and say I want to undistort, and this layer, launch Mocha UI, go to the lens module. So there's my undistortion preview in Mocha. Save that down. Go into the lens module here and say Understorm in Flame, and there it is, rendered interactively in the Flame timeline. I'm conscious that I'm running out of time now, just 5 minutes to go, so I won't be able to go into too much detail on the next example. So I'm going to just show you one that I prepared earlier for analyzing a 3D camera. Essentially what I've done here in Mocha is I've tracked 2 planes. So there's one plane and there's another. In the camera solve module, I can choose to, I've got an example down here, I think. So launch into that. This is the example that I want to show. So in the camera solve module, I'm going to analyze these 2 planes. Need a couple of planes to compare the parallax. In the camera solve module, I'm going to choose the type of motion, the lens. We can choose that automatically if it's not known, and then hit solve to solve the camera. So once I've tracked it, I haven't tracked it yet, but we'll take a look at the example that I created earlier. I can export the solved camera as an FBX file. So if I go in here to the previously created example and jump in there, I can export the camera as an FBX file. So we can export our camera data once it's been measured as an FBX. So then I can go into Flame and then import that FBX camera to look through at the scene. And here we see the nulls for each of the corners in the solution. So the process is measure a couple of planes, solve the camera, export the camera as an FBX, and then we can choose that camera. If I go to the schematic view and zoom in a little bit, you can see the camera that I'm looking through. If I, for example, switch the default camera and look at the default camera, now I'm looking through the default camera at the Mocha camera looking at the scene. If I switch to the Mocha camera, now I'm looking through the Mocha camera, and each of the nulls for all of the objects in the scene generates an axis in Flame. So the current axis that I've got highlighted here is the one that I'm using to parent my 3D object. And the camera motion relative to that null is as measured in Mocha. So it's a kind of, rather than using a dense point cloud to measure the camera, this is a quick and easy way to solve a camera relative to a planar region using Mocha's tools. So I'm conscious that I've run out of time, so I'm going to hand back to Jessie.
Yes.
And if you have any questions, now's the time to ask.